They say photographs capture moments frozen in time, innocent snapshots of lives long past, preserved forever in sepia tones and fading emulsion. But sometimes, when you look closely enough, those same images reveal secrets that were never meant to be found. This is the story of one such photograph, an ordinary school picture taken in a small town in Massachusetts in 1898, that would haunt everyone who truly saw what was hiding in the corner. The photograph first surfaced in the spring of 2019 when Margaret Chen, a historical archivist at the Brookfield Historical Society, was cataloguing a collection of donated materials from the estate of Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who had passed away at 97 years old. Among the dusty boxes of correspondence, property deeds and family Bibles, Margaret discovered a leather portfolio containing dozens of photographs dating back to the late 19th century. Most were standard fare, stern-faced relatives posing stiffly before painted backdrops, wedding portraits with couples who looked more terrified than joyful, and scenic views of long-vanished storefronts along Main Street. But one photograph stopped her cold. It was a class portrait, clearly taken at a local schoolhouse, showing roughly 30 children arranged in 3 neat rows. The boys wore dark wool suits with high collars, their hair slicked back with pomade. The girls dressed in white blouses and dark pinafores, their hair pulled back in tight braids or topped with ribbons. At the center stood a severe-looking woman in her 40s, undoubtedly the teacher, her hands clasped at her waist, her expression suggesting she tolerated no nonsense in her classroom. On the back of the photograph, written in fading ink, were the words, "Miss Abernathy's 4th grade class, Brookfield Elementary, October 1898. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Margaret had seen hundreds of similar photographs throughout her career, children from another era, frozen in formal poses, their faces betraying hints of boredom or nervousness at having to sit still for the lengthy exposure time required by cameras of that period. She nearly placed it in the processing pile with the others, but something made her look again, something her subconscious had registered, but her conscious mind hadn't yet processed. She held the photograph closer to the lamp on her desk, adjusting her reading glasses. The image was remarkably clear for its age, preserved well in the sealed portfolio. She could make out individual faces, see the texture of the wooden floorboards beneath the children's feet, notice the slightly crooked frame of a map hanging on the wall behind them. And then she saw it. In the back left corner of the photograph, partially obscured by the taller students in the rear row, was a child who didn't belong. While all the other children stared directly at the camera with varying degrees of composure, this child's head was turned at an unnatural angle, face directed toward the wall. The posture was all wrong, shoulders hunched forward, arms hanging limply at the sides, legs positioned as if the child had been caught mid-step rather than posed properly. Most disturbing was the clothing. While every other student wore the typical school attire of the era, this child appeared to be dressed in what looked like a nightgown, pale and shapeless, completely at odds with the formal dress of the others. Margaret felt a chill run through her despite the warm afternoon. She grabbed her magnifying glass from the desk drawer and examined the child more closely. The figure's features were difficult to distinguish due to the turned head and the slight blur that affected only that portion of the photograph, as if the child had moved during the exposure. But there was something about the way the other children were positioned that struck her as significant. None of them were looking at this child. In fact, the students nearest to the figure seemed to be leaning ever so slightly away, as if unconsciously creating distance. She spent the next hour examining every detail of the photograph, making notes, measuring proportions, comparing the mysterious child to the others. The more she looked, the more questions emerged. Why would a child be allowed in a formal class portrait wearing nightclothes? Why was this child alone, not looking at the camera? And most puzzling of all, why did it seem as though the other children and even the teacher were pretending this child wasn't there? Margaret photographed the image with her phone and sent it to her colleague David Torres, who worked in the photographic preservation department at the State Archives in Boston. Her message was brief. "Need your eyes on this. Something's not right." Within an hour, David called her back, his voice tight with the same unease she'd felt. "Where did you get this?" he asked without preamble. "Estate donation. Why, what do you see?" There was a long pause. "Margaret, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've restored thousands of historical photographs, and I'm telling you, something about that child in the corner. It's not following the same physical rules as the rest of the image. David arrived in Brookfield the following morning. Driving the hour and a half from Boston, with a case full of equipment Margaret had never seen him bring to a consultation before. She met him at the Historical Society building, a converted Victorian house on Elm Street that smelled perpetually of old paper and furniture polish. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of her office as she led him to her desk, where the photograph lay under a protective sheet of archival tissue. "Show me everything you found in that estate collection," David said, not bothering with pleasantries. He'd worked with Margaret on dozens of projects over the years, and she'd never seen him this focused, this urgent. They spent the morning going through every item from Eleanor Whitmore's estate: birth certificates, marriage licenses, property records, the standard accumulation of a long life. Eleanor had been born in Brookfield in 1922, the granddaughter of Thomas Whitmore, a local merchant who'd owned a general store on Main Street in the late 1800s. Her family had been prominent in town affairs, serving on school boards and town councils for generations. But nowhere in the collection was there any explanation for the photograph, any letter or document that referenced it directly. David set up his equipment on Margaret's desk, a high-resolution digital microscope, a spectral imaging device, and his laptop loaded with forensic photo analysis software. He worked in silence for nearly 2 hours, examining every millimeter of the photograph, taking measurements, running tests Margaret didn't fully understand. She brought him coffee and sandwiches from the cafe down the street, which he barely touched. Finally, he sat back in his chair and ran his hands through his hair. "I need to show you something," he said, turning the laptop screen toward her. On it was the photograph, but enhanced and magnified to show details invisible to the naked eye. He'd isolated the figure in the corner, applying filters that removed the blur and sharpened the image. Margaret leaned closer. What she saw made her stomach drop. The child's face, now partially visible, was thin to the point of gauntness, with dark circles under the eyes that suggested illness or malnutrition. But it was the expression that disturbed her most, not the blank stare of a bored student or the nervous smile of a child unused to cameras, but something else entirely, something that looked like fear. "That's not all," David said quietly. He pulled up another enhanced section of the photograph, this time showing the floorboards beneath the children's feet. Every student cast a shadow, subtle but visible in the analysis, created by the natural light coming through the classroom windows. Every student except one. The child in the corner cast no shadow at all. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered. "It has to be a trick of the light, or the angle, or—" "I thought the same thing," David interrupted. "So I checked the light source, calculated the angles, ran every test I know. Margaret, by every physical law of photography, that child should cast a shadow. Every other element in this photograph follows consistent rules of light and optics, except that figure." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on Margaret's wall. Finally, she spoke. "So what are you saying? That this is a fake? Some kind of trick photography?" David shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. I analyzed the paper, the emulsion, the chemical composition of the developing agents. This photograph is authentic to the 1890s. There's no evidence of double exposure, no signs of manual retouching or manipulation. This image was captured exactly as we see it in a single exposure on October something, 1898. "Then how?" "I don't know," David admitted, "but I think we need to find out who this child was, and more importantly, I think we need to find out what happened in that classroom." That afternoon, Margaret began pulling school records from the town archives. The Brookfield school system had maintained meticulous attendance logs and enrollment records since its founding in 1842, and the 1898 records were intact, stored in leather-bound volumes in the climate-controlled vault in the basement. She found Miss Abernathy's fourth-grade class roster easily enough, 32 students listed, their names written in the teacher's precise handwriting. She cross-referenced the names with the faces in the photograph, working systematically from left to right, front row to back. Most of the children she could identify from other photographs in the Historical Society's collection, families that still had descendants in Brookfield, names that appeared on street signs and memorial plaques around town. The Hendersons, the Pratts, the Wainwrights, old Brookfield families, their histories well documented. But when she reached the child in the corner, she hit a wall. She counted the children in the photograph 3 times, 33 figures, but the roster listed only 32 names. She checked the list again, verified each identified child, made sure she hadn't miscounted. No matter how many times she checked, the numbers didn't match. There was one child in that photograph who, according to the official school records, had never existed at all. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed in the small apartment above the Historical Society, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions that had no rational answers. By dawn, she'd made a decision. She needed to know more about Miss Abernathy and what had happened in that classroom in the autumn of 1898. The Brookfield Town Hall opened at 8 o'clock, and Margaret was waiting at the door when the clerk arrived. The vital records for the late 19th century were stored in filing cabinets in a windowless room on the 2nd floor. Margaret knew the system well. She'd spent countless hours here researching family histories for visitors to the Historical Society. She pulled the death records for 1898 and began reading. Most were mundane tragedies of the era: infants lost to fever, elderly citizens succumbing to pneumonia, occasional accidents involving farm equipment or house fires. But in early November 1898, just weeks after the school photograph would have been taken, there was an entry that made her pause. A child named Samuel Birch, age 9, cause of death listed as consumption, buried in the town cemetery on November 7th. The parents were listed as William and Patience Birch, address given as the Old Mill District near the river. Consumption, tuberculosis, was common enough in that era, but something about the timing nagged at her. She made a note of the name and kept searching. 2 entries later, she found another child, Emma Talbot, age 10, died November 12th, cause also listed as consumption. Then another, James Whitfield, age 9, died November 18th. All within the same 2-week period. All approximately the same age. All from the same disease. Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled the records for December. 4 more children. Then, in January 1899, 3 more. By the time she'd worked through the winter records, she'd counted 11 children, all between the ages of 8 and 10, all dead within 4 months of when that school photograph was taken. And when she cross-referenced the names with Miss Abernathy's class roster, her blood ran cold. Every single one of those dead children had been students in that 4th grade class. She practically ran back to the Historical Society, her breath forming clouds in the cold March air. In her office, she pulled out the photograph again and began marking faces. Samuel Birch, 2nd row, 3rd from the left. Emma Talbot, front row, 5th from the right. James Whitfield, back row, far right. One by one, she identified the children who would be dead within months of this photograph being taken. 11 children out of 32, more than a third of the class. And then there was the figure in the corner, the child who wasn't on any roster, who cast no shadow, whose existence the official records denied entirely. Margaret called David, her voice shaking as she explained what she'd found. "We need to look at the town newspaper archives," she told him. "There has to be something about this. You don't lose 11 children in 4 months without the community taking notice." The Brookfield Gazette had been published weekly since 1867, and the Historical Society maintained bound volumes of every issue. Margaret pulled 1898 and 1899 and began reading through October, November, December. At first, the deaths were reported as individual tragedies, brief obituaries noting the passing of young lives, mentions of funeral services at the Congregational Church, expressions of sympathy for grieving families. But by mid-November, the tone changed. An editorial dated November 20th, 1898, written by the newspaper's editor, spoke of growing concern about the outbreak of disease affecting the town's children. The school board had held an emergency meeting to discuss whether to close the elementary school. Parents were keeping healthy children home, afraid of contagion. Dr. Harrison Vance, the town's physician, was quoted as saying he'd never seen such a virulent strain of tuberculosis concentrated in such a specific age group. but it was an article from December 3, 1898, that made Margaret's hands freeze on the yellowed newsprint. The headline read, "Mystery Surrounds Outbreak at Elementary School." The article reported that while the consumption diagnosis was consistent with the symptoms, fever, coughing, weight loss, several parents had told the reporter their children had mentioned seeing a pale child in their classroom, a student none of them recognized. The children described this figure as sickly and strange, appearing in the corner of the room during lessons, never speaking, never moving, just watching. Miss Abernathy had been interviewed for the article. The teacher stated firmly that there was no such child in her classroom, that all her students were accounted for, and that the sick children were likely suffering from fever-induced hallucinations. She suggested the parents were allowing imagination and grief to create phantoms where none existed. The school board supported her statement, and the newspaper printed it without further question. But Margaret knew now what had really happened. That photograph didn't lie. There had been a pale child in that classroom, a child in nightclothes, a child who didn't appear in any records, a child who cast no shadow. And somehow, that child's presence had been connected to the deaths that followed. Margaret found the final piece of the puzzle 3 days later, buried in a property record from 1897. Before the elementary school had been built on Cedar Street in 1885, the land had been occupied by a different structure, the Brookfield Home for Indigent Children, a charitable institution that had housed orphans and children from destitute families. The home had closed in 1884, following a scandal involving neglect and abuse, and the building had been demolished. But the town records included a list of children who'd been residents in the home's final year. Near the bottom of the list, she found a name, Thomas Brennan, age 7, admitted March 1883, died September 1884, cause of death, consumption, no family listed, no known relatives, buried in an unmarked grave in the town cemetery's paupers section. A child who died alone, sick and forgotten, in the building that once stood where Miss Abernathy's classroom would later be. Margaret sat back in her chair, the pieces falling into place with a horrifying clarity. The school had been built on the site of a children's home where dozens of forgotten, mistreated children had lived and died. And somehow, one of those children, Thomas Brennan, or perhaps another whose death went unrecorded entirely, had remained, not as a memory but as something else, something that had manifested in that fourth-grade classroom in 1898, visible to the camera's lens and to the children who shared the space with it, but denied and ignored by the adults who should have protected them. David returned to Brookfield with a team from the State Historical Preservation Department. They brought ground-penetrating radar, archival specialists, and a forensic photographer who'd worked on authenticated paranormal documentation cases. Margaret had been hesitant to use that word, paranormal, but David had been blunt. "Whatever happened in that classroom defies natural explanation," he'd said. "We need to approach this with open minds and proper documentation." They started with the school building itself. Brookfield Elementary still stood on Cedar Street, though it had been converted into a community center in 1978, when a new, larger school was built on the edge of town. The building was mostly used for town meetings and recreational programs now, but the original classroom layout remained largely intact. Margaret led them to what would have been Miss Abernathy's room on the first floor, facing north. The space looked nothing like the photograph now. The wooden floors had been covered with linoleum in the 1950s. The walls painted a cheerful yellow instead of the dark green visible in the historical image. But the dimensions were the same, the windows in the same positions, and in the back left corner, where the pale child had stood in the photograph, there was a storage closet that Margaret couldn't remember ever seeing open in all her years visiting this building. The custodian, a man named Richard Moss who'd worked at the community center for 15 years, unlocked the closet for them. It was small, barely 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, filled with folding chairs and old supplies. But when they pulled everything out, they found something unusual. The back wall of the closet was plywood, obviously added sometime after the building's original construction. And behind it, when David carefully pried away the wood, they discovered a small alcove built into the original brick wall. Inside the alcove was a child's leather shoe, cracked and deteriorated with age but still recognizable, the type of shoe children would have worn in the 1880s, And next to it, scratched into the brick in crude, desperate letters, were words that made everyone in the room fall silent. Thomas. I was here. I was real. They spent the rest of that day documenting everything. The alcove, the shoe, the message. They brought in the ground-penetrating radar and scanned the area beneath the building. The results showed evidence of the old foundation from the children's home and something else. Anomalies in the soil consistent with unmarked graves. At least a dozen of them, right beneath where the school's foundation had been laid. Margaret contacted the town council that evening, presenting everything they'd found. The reaction was mixed. Some council members were skeptical, suggesting the scratched words could be from any era, that the graves could be from before the children's home existed. Others were deeply disturbed, arguing that if there were really unmarked children's graves under a public building, they had an ethical obligation to investigate further. The debate continued for weeks, with newspaper articles, town meetings, and heated arguments between those who wanted to dig and those who thought it was better to let the past stay buried. But Margaret was relentless. She gathered more evidence, more documentation. She found descendants of the children who died in 1898 and 1899, and interviewed them about family stories passed down through generations. Several remembered grandparents or great-grandparents mentioning the year the children died, and a few recalled vague references to something being wrong at the school, though specifics had been lost to time. Finally, in June of 2019, the town council voted to authorize a controlled archaeological excavation of the site. The work began in July, with a team from the State University's Anthropology Department carefully removing layers of earth beneath the community center's foundation. What they found confirmed Margaret's research: 12 small coffins, simple pine boxes that had mostly deteriorated, containing the remains of children. Most were between the ages of 5 and 10. Several showed signs of malnutrition and disease, and one, which they determined through forensic analysis had been in the ground since approximately 1884, contained a child of about 7 years old who died of tuberculosis. The local church held a memorial service in August. The children's remains were reinterred in the town cemetery with proper markers, their names researched and restored where possible. Thomas Brennan's grave received a headstone reading, Thomas Brennan, 1876-1884. Lost but not forgotten. You were real. Margaret stood at the ceremony along with 200 other Brookfield residents, watching as a local pastor said words over the graves that should have been spoken more than a century before. She thought about Miss Abernathy, who'd denied what her students were seeing, and about the 11 children who'd died in the months following that photograph. She wondered if things would have been different if the adults had listened, if they'd acknowledged what the children already knew, that something wrong lingered in that classroom, something that needed to be recognized and put to rest. After the reburial, Margaret had the photograph examined one final time. David ran the same analyses, applied the same filters, and this time the figure in the corner was different, still visible, still present in the image. Photography doesn't change after all. But the blur was gone. The image was clearer now, showing the face of a young boy, thin and sick, but with an expression that Margaret could only describe as peaceful. And in the enhanced version, if you looked very carefully, you could just barely make out what might have been a shadow on the floor beneath him, faint but finally present. Some mysteries don't have neat explanations, Margaret learned. Some things exist in the spaces between what we can prove and what we can understand. But she knew, looking at that photograph, that something had been resolved. Thomas Brennan had spent more than a century trying to be seen, trying to prove his existence mattered, and finally, someone had listened. The photograph remains in the Brookfield Historical Society's collection, properly preserved and documented. Margaret includes it in educational programs about the town's history, telling the full story now: the children's home, the unmarked graves, the outbreak of disease, and the pale figure who appeared to warn or to bear witness or simply to be acknowledged. She doesn't claim to know which. She only knows that sometimes the past refuses to stay silent, and that photographs, for all their stillness, can speak volumes if we're willing to truly see what they're showing us. The story of the photograph should have ended there, with the memorial service and the peaceful reburial. But for Margaret Chen, it was only the beginning of a deeper investigation that would consume the next 2 years of her life. She couldn't shake the feeling that while they'd answered some questions, others remained buried beneath layers of history and deliberate silence. In September 2019, Margaret received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Dr. Rachel Morrison, a medical historian at Johns Hopkins University who specialized in 19th-century disease outbreaks. Dr. Morrison had read about the Brookfield case in an academic journal and wanted to discuss the tuberculosis deaths that had followed the photograph. The two women met in Baltimore in early October, and what Dr. Morrison shared fundamentally changed Margaret's understanding of what had happened. "I've been studying consumption patterns in New England for 15 years, Dr. Morrison explained, spreading documents across the table in her university office. "And this Brookfield outbreak doesn't fit any known pattern. Tuberculosis typically spreads through prolonged close contact with infected individuals. It moves slowly through communities, affecting family members first, then neighbors, then broader social circles. But in Brookfield, it targeted a very specific group, children in a single classroom, with unprecedented speed and lethality." Margaret listened as Dr. Morrison outlined the medical anomalies. The 11 children who died had all shown symptoms within days of each other, not the staggered progression typical of tuberculosis transmission. Their deaths occurred rapidly, within weeks rather than the months or years the disease usually took. And most puzzling, none of their family members contracted the disease, despite caring for them during their final illnesses. "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Dr. Morrison pulled out another document, a medical report from 1884 regarding the Brookfield Home for Indigent Children. The children's home was closed following an investigation into neglect, but there was something else. The facility's physician, a Dr. Edmund Hartwell, was accused of conducting unauthorized medical experiments on the residents. The charges were never proven, and Dr. Hartwell disappeared before any formal inquiry could proceed, but several former staff members testified that he'd been obsessed with finding a treatment for consumption. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "You think he infected those children deliberately?" "I think he may have developed something," Dr. Morrison said carefully. "Some experimental treatment or vaccine that went catastrophically wrong. And I think whatever he created might have remained in that building, in the soil or the structure itself, after it was demolished. When the school was built on the same site 13 years later, somehow that contamination became active again." They spent the next 6 months gathering evidence. Margaret obtained permission to test soil samples from beneath the community center. Dr. Morrison arranged for laboratory analysis using modern techniques that could identify bacterial DNA from historical samples. What they found was unprecedented, traces of a tuberculosis strain that showed evidence of deliberate genetic manipulation, impossible for the 1880s, but unmistakably present in the samples. "This shouldn't exist," Dr. Morrison said, staring at the lab results. "This kind of genetic alteration requires technology that wasn't developed until the 1970s, yet the soil tests confirm these samples are from the 1880s. Somehow Dr. Hartwell achieved something that shouldn't have been possible for another century." Margaret thought about Thomas Brennan, the 7-year-old boy who died in the children's home, who'd scratched his name into a wall to prove he'd existed. She wondered how many other children had been subjected to Dr. Hartwell's experiments, how many had suffered in silence before the home was finally closed. But there was another question that haunted her. The photograph had captured something impossible, a figure that cast no shadow, a presence that didn't appear in official records. If Dr. Hartwell had created something that transcended natural law at a biological level, was it possible he'd unleashed something that transcended natural law in other ways as well? Something that had lingered in that place, waiting for new victims. In March 2020, just before the pandemic shut down much of her research, Margaret made one final discovery. In the Massachusetts State Archives, buried in a collection of uncatalogued medical documents, she found Dr. Hartwell's personal journals. The entries from 1883 and 1884 described his experiments in clinical detail, attempts to create a weakened form of tuberculosis that could immunize children against the disease. He'd tested his formulas on the residents of the children's home, documenting their symptoms, their suffering, their deaths. But the final entries, written days before the home was closed, revealed something else. Dr. Hartwell had realized his experiments had created something he couldn't control, a pathogen that didn't follow normal rules of biology or mortality. In his last entry, dated September 23, 1884, he wrote, "What I have made cannot be unmade. It persists beyond death, beyond burial, beyond all natural cycles. God forgive me. I have created a sickness that infects not just the body, but the very fabric of the place itself. I must flee, but I fear it will remain long after I am dust." Thomas Brennan had died 2 days later, on September 25, 1884. And 13 years after that, his presence, or something wearing his form, had appeared in Miss Abernathy's classroom, visible to the camera and to the children who would soon fall ill. Margaret's discovery of Dr. Hartwell's journal should have been the climax of her investigation, but instead it opened even darker questions. She contacted epidemiologists, historians and scientists who specialized in emerging diseases, but none could adequately explain how a 19th-century physician could have created something that defied modern understanding of pathology. The consensus was troubling. Either the journals were elaborate frauds, or Dr. Hartwell had stumbled upon something that science still couldn't fully comprehend. In June 2020, working from her apartment during lockdown, Margaret began a different kind of research. She started tracking the history of the site itself, going back further than the children's home. Property records showed the land had been purchased by the Brookfield Charitable Society in 1880, but before that, it had been undeveloped forest on the edge of town. She found references to it in early colonial documents as a place where settlers avoided building, though the reasons given were vague: unsuitable soil, poor drainage, proximity to marshland. Then she found something in a diary entry from 1749, written by Reverend Josiah Whitcomb, one of Brookfield's founding ministers. He described the land as a place where the native peoples would not tread, saying it was a thin place where the worlds touched, where the boundary between life and death grew fragile in certain seasons. The settlers had dismissed these warnings as superstition, but Reverend Whitcomb noted that several families who'd attempted to farm the land had abandoned it, after experiencing strange illnesses and unsettling visions. Margaret cross-referenced this with historical records of Native American settlements in the region. She contacted Dr. James Whitehorse, an anthropologist who specialized in indigenous history of New England. Dr. Whitehorse explained that several tribes in Massachusetts had concepts of places where spiritual boundaries were weak, locations that required special respect and avoidance. These weren't necessarily evil places, but they were dangerous, areas where the normal rules didn't fully apply. "Your town built a children's home on one of these sites?" Dr. Whitehorse asked, his voice heavy with concern. "And then conducted medical experiments there, and then built a school on top of all that?" Margaret confirmed it all, feeling the weight of accumulated mistakes and tragedies. Each generation had ignored warnings, dismissing them as superstition or ignorance, layering new suffering on top of old. The place itself might have been neutral, a natural anomaly, but human actions had twisted it into something else. She returned to the 1898 photograph with this new context. The figure in the corner, whether it was truly Thomas Brennan or some amalgamation of all the children who'd suffered in that place, had appeared at a moment when the boundaries were thinnest. The photograph itself had been taken in late October, just before the day when many cultures believe the veil between worlds grows permeable. Miss Abernathy's classroom had been full of children the same age as those who died in the home 14 years earlier. Everything had aligned to create a perfect storm of repetition and manifestation. Margaret began searching for other instances where the place might have revealed itself. She found records of maintenance workers at the community center, reporting odd experiences over the decades: cold spots in the corner of that particular room, sounds of children crying when the building was empty, occasions when photographs taken during events showed strange shadows or unexplained figures in the background. Most had been dismissed, explained away, or simply never officially reported for fear of ridicule. In September 2020, she interviewed Harold Banks, who'd been a janitor at the elementary school from 1965 until it closed in 1978. He was 83 years old now, living in a nursing home in the next town over, and he'd been reluctant to talk until Margaret explained what she'd discovered. "I told them something was wrong with that room," Harold said, his hands shaking slightly as he held a cup of coffee. "Children didn't want to go in there. Teachers would request different classrooms. We had more sick calls from classes in that room than anywhere else in the building, but nobody wanted to hear it. They said I was being foolish, that buildings don't make people sick." He described an incident in 1972 when a teacher had taken a class photograph in that room. When the film was developed, there was a figure in the back corner that nobody remembered being present during the photo session. A pale child in outdated clothing, barely visible but definitely there. The teacher had been so disturbed she'd quit at the end of that year. The photograph had been thrown away, dismissed as a developing error. "How many times?" Margaret asked quietly. "How many times did it appear?" Harold thought for a moment. 4 or 5 times that I knew about. Always in photographs, always in that corner, always around October or November. People would whisper about it for a few days, then everybody would forget or pretend to forget. Easier that way. Margaret left the nursing home that afternoon, understanding something fundamental about what had happened in Brookfield. The appearance in the 1898 photograph hadn't been unique. It had been one instance in a pattern that had repeated for over a century. The figure, whatever it was, had been trying to be seen, trying to communicate something, and each time it manifested, people had chosen to look away. She thought about the 11 children who died in 1898 and 1899. They'd seen the figure, they'd mentioned it to their parents, and the adults had dismissed it as fever dreams or imagination. By the time people took the children's report seriously, it was too late. The pattern had completed itself again. The question Margaret couldn't escape was whether the reburial had truly ended the cycle. The memorial service in August 2019 had felt conclusive, a proper acknowledgement of forgotten suffering. But as she dug deeper into the site's history, she wondered if recognizing the dead was enough, or if the place itself needed something more fundamental to heal the wound that had been opened and reopened for more than 2 centuries. In October 2020, Margaret returned to the community center with a team of environmental scientists. They conducted comprehensive testing of the building's materials, air quality, and soil composition. The results were both reassuring and unsettling. The tuberculosis DNA that Dr. Morrison had found in 2019 samples was no longer detectable. Whatever had been active in the soil seemed to have become dormant or dispersed after the children's remains were properly buried. But other anomalies remained. Temperature readings in the northwest corner of the former classroom showed consistent variations that couldn't be explained by HVAC patterns or building materials. Electromagnetic field measurements in that area spiked periodically for no apparent reason, and most strangely, audio recordings captured during overnight monitoring sessions picked up sounds that resembled children's voices, though the building was empty and locked. Dr. Sarah Blackwell, a physicist from MIT who specialized in environmental anomalies, spent 3 days studying the site. Her conclusion was carefully worded. "I can't say definitively what's causing these phenomena," she told Margaret, "but I can say that this location exhibits properties that don't align with our standard models. It's as if the space itself retains some kind of memory or impression of past events. Whether that's explainable through quantum mechanics, electromagnetic fields, or something we don't yet understand, I can't say." Margaret organized a community meeting in November 2020 to share her findings and discuss what should be done. The response was mixed. Some residents argued the community center should be demolished, that no amount of acknowledgement could cleanse a place with such a troubled history. Others felt that destroying the building would be another form of erasure, wiping away the physical evidence of what had happened there. Eleanor Whitmore's nephew, James Whitmore, attended the meeting. He was 73 years old and had grown up in Brookfield hearing vague family stories about the photograph his aunt had preserved. "My aunt never talked much about why she kept that picture," he told the assembled crowd, "but in the last years before she passed, she told me she felt responsible for maintaining it. She said her family had known about the children's home, known about the experiments and had done nothing. Keeping that photograph was her way of making sure somebody eventually paid attention. His words resonated with Margaret. The photograph had been more than historical documentation. It had been a deliberate act of witnessing, kept safe through generations until someone finally looked closely enough to see what it was showing. Eleanor Whitmore had been part of a chain of guardianship, ensuring the evidence survived until the right moment. The town council ultimately decided on a compromise. The community centre would remain standing, but the room where Miss Abernathy's classroom had been would be converted into a permanent memorial and educational space. The walls would display the history of the site, the Indigenous warnings, the children's home, Dr. Hartwell's experiments, the 1898 deaths, and the reburial. The original photograph would be exhibited there, properly preserved behind UV protective glass, with full context provided for visitors. The memorial room opened in March 2021, designed by a team that included Indigenous consultants, historians and descendants of the families affected by the various tragedies. A permanent installation included the names of all the children known to have died at the children's home and in the 1898-1899 outbreak. In the northwest corner, where the figure had appeared in photographs, stood a simple sculpture. A child's shoe cast in bronze, resting on a pedestal inscribed with words adapted from Thomas Brennan's desperate message, "We were here. We were real. We are remembered." Margaret attended the opening ceremony, along with nearly 500 Brookfield residents and visitors from around the state. Dr. Whitehorse performed a blessing ceremony, asking for peace for the place and all who had suffered there. Several descendants of the children who died in 1898 and 1899 spoke about the importance of remembering difficult histories rather than burying them. In the weeks following the opening, staff members reported something unexpected. The temperature anomalies in the corner had stabilized, the electromagnetic readings had returned to normal, the audio phenomena had ceased. Dr. Blackwell returned to conduct follow-up measurements and confirmed the changes. "It's as if the space has settled," she said, clearly puzzled but intrigued. Whatever was creating those unusual readings seems to have resolved. Margaret stood in the memorial room one evening in April 2021, alone with the photograph and her thoughts. She'd spent more than 2 years pursuing this investigation, uncovering layers of tragedy and neglect that stretched back centuries. She'd learned that some wounds in the world can't be healed by simply covering them over, that acknowledgement and remembrance have power beyond simple sentiment. She looked at the figure in the corner of the photograph, that pale child who'd started everything. The image hadn't changed, it never would, preserved forever in silver and paper. But somehow it felt different now, the expression less disturbing, the presence less demanding. Thomas Brennan, or whoever that child had been, had finally achieved what he'd been seeking for more than a century. He'd been seen, he'd been acknowledged. His existence had been proven and honored. The story of the 1898 photograph became something of a sensation in historical and paranormal research circles. Margaret received interview requests from documentaries, podcasts, and academic programs. She was careful in how she presented the case, focusing on the documented facts while acknowledging the elements that defied conventional explanation. She refused to sensationalize or fabricate, but she also refused to dismiss the experiences and evidence that couldn't be neatly categorized. In July 2021, she published a comprehensive paper in the Journal of American Historical Research, detailing the investigation from the photograph's discovery through the memorial opening. The paper included contributions from Dr. Morrison, Dr. Whitehorse, Dr. Blackwell, and a dozen other specialists who'd been involved in various aspects of the research. It was titled Visible Evidence, Photography, Memory, and Historical Trauma in 19th Century Brookfield, Massachusetts. The paper's impact extended beyond academic circles. Other historical societies and archives began reviewing their collections for similar cases, photographs that might contain evidence of forgotten or suppressed tragedies. A museum in Pennsylvania contacted Margaret about a school photograph from 1902 that showed unexplained figures. An archive in Vermont found documents suggesting a pattern of institutional abuse similar to what Dr. Hartwell had perpetrated. The Brookfield case had opened doors that many hadn't realized were closed. For Margaret personally, The investigation had changed her understanding of her work's purpose. She'd always seen historical preservation as important for maintaining connections to the past, but now she understood it could also be about justice, giving voice to those who'd been silenced, making visible what had been deliberately hidden. The photograph had been crying out for attention for more than a century, and she'd been the one to finally hear it. In September 2021, on the anniversary of Thomas Brennan's death, the town held a remembrance ceremony at the memorial room. It became an annual tradition, a day when Brookfield acknowledged its complicated history and honored those who'd suffered. Margaret was invited to speak each year, but she usually kept her remarks brief. The day wasn't about her or her investigation. It was about the children whose stories had been recovered and restored. David Torres, who'd been instrumental in analyzing the photograph in those early days, visited Brookfield in October 2021. He and Margaret walked through the memorial room together, looking at the exhibits they'd helped create. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked, studying the photograph behind its protective glass. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think this particular cycle is over. The children have been honored, the history acknowledged. But there are probably dozens of places like this, sites where suffering has been layered on suffering, where the boundaries between past and present have grown thin. I think our job is to keep looking, keep listening for the stories that need to be told." They stood in the corner where the figure had appeared, where the bronze shoe sculpture now rested. The space felt ordinary now, just another corner of a public building, warm with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows. Whatever presence had manifested there for more than a century had finally been released. Margaret returned to her regular work at the Historical Society, cataloguing collections and assisting researchers. But she kept one copy of the enhanced photograph on her office wall, the version David had created, that showed Thomas Brennan's face most clearly. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most important historical evidence comes not from what's obvious in documents and records, but from what's hiding in corners, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. The photograph itself remained in the memorial room, viewed by thousands of visitors each year. Parents brought children to learn about the importance of treating all people with dignity, even those who seem different or don't fit into neat categories. Teachers used it to discuss how institutions can fail vulnerable populations. Researchers studied it as an example of how photographic evidence can preserve truths that other records deliberately obscure. But beyond all its educational and historical value, the photograph served one more purpose that Margaret considered most important. Every child who'd stood in Miss Abernathy's classroom in October 1898 was now remembered by name. Every resident of the Brookfield Home for Indigent Children whose identity could be recovered had been honored. And Thomas Brennan, the 7-year-old boy who'd scratched his name into a wall to prove his existence mattered, had been proven right. He was here. He was real. And now, finally, he would never be forgotten again. The photograph that had captured his desperate attempt to be seen had ensured that a century later, someone did see, someone did care, and someone did act to make sure his story, and the stories of all the others who'd suffered in that place, would be told for generations to come. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the scientific anomalies or the unexplained phenomena, but the simple human truth that every life deserves to be acknowledged, every suffering deserves to be witnessed, and every person, no matter how young, how poor, how forgotten, deserves to be remembered as having been here and having been real. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.